in a football program so he can fit in. He never appreciated what his parents did for him. A lot of people grow up in this world and don't have parents, like Antonio and Don. And he took advantage of them every step of the way. An opening statement, the defense asked you to write some things down on your notepad. I hope you did, because I know we did. And this is what he had to tell you. The defendant is a normal 16-year-old. Mr. DeToto rhetorically asked the audience in the courtroom, raise your hand if when you were 16 years old you snuck out of the house. Raise your hand if when you were 16 years old you lied about going to see your girlfriend. Remember that? What he didn't ask you was the more relevant questions. How many of you, when you were 16 years old, took a gun from your parents' room, fired it through the floor of your own house, and then your parents died right after that by the exact same gun? How many of you, when you were 16 years old, took a bottle of rubbing alcohol, put gasoline in it, and poured it across the stairwell of your parents' house and lit it on fire with them still inside? How many of you, when you were 16 years old, lied and manipulated the people closest to you in your life, so much so that they lost all trust in you? I know that some of you on this jury have children. I know that some of you have grandchildren. This is not your son. This is not your grandson. There's something wrong with him. And you sat here and you listened to the same statement that we all listened to. And I could see it in some of your eyes. That's not a normal reaction for a 16-year-old whose parents were just shot in the head in the family home. In that statement, he opens up talking about a football schedule. Yeah, my football schedule, I do 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. The homicide detectives had to tell him, your mom is dead, that's a bad thing. Some of you will know what shock is. Some of you know what shock produces. You don't hear that in his voice. He's not in shock. And ladies and gentlemen, if that's not shock, then that's who he is. And as concerning as that is, he sat here 7 years later in this courtroom and pretended to be upset about the testimony regarding his mother's autopsy. You know what's interesting about that? Is the night that this all happened, when he was down there at the homicide station, they told him, your mom didn't make it. And they opened up the floor to him and they said, tell us about your relationship with your mom. And you know what he said? We all kind of had our issues with her. Those were the words out of his mouth. The defense went on to say the defendant was getting in trouble for normal 16-year-old things. It was the banter of a 16-year-old. Oh, really? Don Armstrong didn't feel that way. It is not for us as lawyers. It is not for us as prosecutors. It is not for them as defense attorneys to tell you how the parents should feel about what was going on in that house. For them to get up here and say, it's just normal 16-year-old stuff. It is not for them to decide that. It's for the people in the house that had to deal with him. And they were concerned. And they didn't trust him. And that sentiment went on and went on all throughout the summer before they died. And you look at those messages, and let me tell you, parents, they didn't talk that way about Josh. They didn't talk that way about Kayra. It was just him, and only him. The defense told you that Armstrong's had financial problems, and that's why the defendant transferred schools. I have no idea why they told you that. I don't get it. They have the same exact text messages that we do. It is undisputed that the reason the defendant did not return to Kincaid is because he failed out. Period. So I don't know why they told you something different. They said Jimmy James previously testified that there were over 100 surveillance cameras in the house. What? What are they talking about? He never said that. I don't even know what else to say about that statement. Then they told you Tim Rader previously testified there were 77 errors in the alarm records in the month of July. Actually, no. Tim Rader never said that. The defense said that. In talking about the alarm records, to claim that they are errors, you have to first understand what an error is. A lot of what they think are errors are not errors. They're misinterpreting the records. There was an insinuation in opening statement that Chelly Rossi did something sinister or at worst something unethical. Chelly Rossi is one of the leading experts in this country in bloodstain pattern analysis. Her work in this case was reviewed and discussed by other national leading experts in the same field. She has helped exonerate people from prison. She got paid $0 from us to come down here and talk to you about a case that isn't even in the county she works for. To insinuate that she did anything unethical is shameful. You know, opening statements is like a contract. We as lawyers tell you what we expect the evidence to show. You hold us to that. John told you in opening statement. We held up our end of the bargain. We told you exactly what the evidence was going to show, and it showed that. The defense wrote you all a bunch of checks in opening statement that they can't cash or have no intention of cashing. I want to talk to you about Josh. We'll never understand. We'll never understand why that family is protecting the defendant and throwing Josh under the bus. Never understand it. But it's not up for us to understand. What I can tell you is this. When the defendant exited that house on July 29, 2016, and let the police in to find his dirty work that he had done, the first person he called was Josh. And Josh woke up his girlfriend, called 911. He grabbed a shotgun. He ran out of the house, got in his car, and drove over to the scene. And he's asking and reacting to ways we all would if we got that phone call. He's pissed off. He's wondering what's going on with his parents. Why can't he get in the house? What's going on with his siblings? And they want you to believe because he didn't ask questions or didn't answer questions regarding gunshot residue, that's indicative of guilt. He didn't understand why he was being treated like a suspect, and we don't either. So, while the defendant was down at the homicide station, challenging investigators, test my hands, you won't find any gunshot residue on me, Josh Armstrong was out there on that street corner with his cousin, and he was picking up the pieces of the family he had left. And he had to watch as everything he loved in that house was carted out on a stretcher. He spent the next several months, because of the trauma of losing his parents, he became paranoid. He started making lists of all the people that could have killed his parents, including everybody in their family. You don't do that if you're the killer. He started spiraling out of control. The girl that loved him the most in his life, who wanted to marry him, left him. I can't blame Hannah for that, because he was no longer the person he used to be. And it was unhealthy for her to stay in that relationship. And he spent the next several years in and out of psych hospitals. The defense thinks that these medical records are good for them. Talk about confirmation bias. They're taking 3 lines in records that are thousands of pages, which says Josh Armstrong witnessed the murder of his parents, and they want you to believe that means he was the killer. They're ignoring. They've chosen to ignore the thousands of pages that talk about how his parents' death was the absolute worst day of his entire life. Josh has shown way more emotion in the wake of his parents' death than this defendant is even capable of showing. They called 2 witnesses. One of them was Kay Winston. Miss Winston told you about an incident, remember, at the church. Josh showed up at the church. He was standoffish, and he had a stare. And they interpreted that. They tried to affiliate that with mental illness. Josh makes reference to that statement in the medical records, and it wasn't published for you all, but it's in there. Josh had something to say about that incident. And you know what he said? He said, when I got to the church, I realized, his dad's church, I realized my dad wasn't there. And it affected him so hard that after that, he said that he wanted to get in his car and drive off a bridge and kill himself. Then, the defense put up a doctor who has a medical degree, apparently, I don't know how, and he told you that the note left at the scene has religious connotations to it. The note says, I've been watching for a long time, come get me. Then, that same doctor said Josh was angry because his mom sat him down at 13 years old and told him that his dad wasn't his biological dad. I mean, seriously, is anybody believing this stuff? This is disgusting. I'm sorry, we got to tell it like it is. This is disgusting. And as righteous as it is to stand before you today and tell you that the defendant in this case is 100% guilty of killing his parents, it is just as righteous to ask you something. Something that most prosecutors will never get to ask in their entire career. I'm asking you to find somebody innocent in this case, but not the defendant. Josh Armstrong was wrongfully accused in this courtroom for a crime he did not commit, but not by us, by them. The judge told you at the very beginning the defense doesn't have to put on a case. It's their choice. They chose to put on a case, and their case is that Josh Armstrong did this. Are they so desperate that they would sacrifice one brother for the other? Your verdict can change all this. You can make this right. You can set the record straight. Josh Armstrong doesn't deserve to go the rest of his life, people see him and say, there he is, there's the one they say murdered his parents. And if they get up here, after I'm done talking to you, and they say, oh, we're not trying to say Josh did it, just that he could have, ask them why they spent half an hour an opening statement trying to frighten you with his medical records. I'm going to let John talk about the crime scene, but there is something I want to mention to you regarding Josh. The defendant called 911 in this case at 1:40 in the morning. First responders were on the doorsteps of that house at 1:46. 6 minutes. If the defendant is not the killer in this case, that means the person would have had to put pillows over the heads, run out of the room, but not before turning to crack the door shut, run down the hall, down the stairs, go through the kitchen, pull out a bunch of drawers, take a pen, a pad, write a note scribbling over it several times to mask their penmanship, put the pad back in the drawer, put the note down, put the gun down, the pen next to it, and lock up the house on their way out. 6 minutes. And they're trying to tell you with a straight face that a psychotic person did it in 6 minutes. And the last thing I'll tell you about Josh, when the defendant called him to the scene that night, you know what he said? Josh told him, "Your story makes no sense," which is the same thing the Houston Police Department has been telling him ever since. Sound like a psychotic person to you? John's going to talk a lot about the physical evidence in this case, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the scientific evidence. You heard a lot of things, and juries commonly want to know this stuff, right? DNA, fingerprints, gunshot residue, blood. Tell us about that. What we know from the scientific evidence regarding the DNA in this case, Courtney Head, remember the manager of the biology section of that lab, she said this was the most difficult report she had ever written. And the reason is because you're dealing with family members. They all live in the same house. They share the same DNA. So while a lot of things were swabbed in this case, the pen was swabbed, the gun was swabbed, kitchen drawers were swabbed, the upstairs nightstand in Antonio's and Don's room was swabbed. The problem is you're dealing with all people, mixtures of DNA from the same family, and they can't parse it out. They can't take it out and say it's this one person. But I'll tell you what we can say about Josh Armstrong. His DNA was submitted, and he didn't come back to moderate support, strong support, or very strong support on anything in that house. We cannot tell you that the defendant's DNA is not on those items. We can't. So if they get up here and tell you the defendant's DNA isn't on anything, it's inaccurate. We don't know. We don't know because we can't parse it out. We talked about fingerprints. And one of the things that Rebecca Green testified regarding fingerprints is they have to make a decision whenever they take evidence, right? You can take it to the DNA lab or you can take it to the fingerprint lab. And those labs will talk with one another because here's the thing. If you swab for DNA, you may lose some of the fingerprints. If you go fingerprints first, you may lose some of the DNA. In this case, they chose to go with the DNA first. So when she testified and told you that damaged some of the items we could test for fingerprints, like the gun and the note, that's what she meant. They tried. Jonathan Petronic tried. He swabbed things in the nightstand, bullets. He swabbed over 70 bullets. And the friction ridge detail wasn't rich enough. It doesn't mean the defendant didn't touch those items. It just means we don't have the information to say whether he did or not. A lot was made about gunshot residue in this case. And a common misconception is that whenever somebody fires a gun, there's going to be gunshot residue on their hands. First of all, we know that .22s do not commonly produce gunshot residue. And we also know it's because they don't have one of the elements. It's antimony. And the manufacturer of that ammunition is not going to tell us. It's protected by proprietary means. So they're not going to disclose to us what the ingredients are that is in the bullet itself. The defense yelled at Jason Schroeder for not taking the gun to his lab and testing it for gunshot residue. And what Mr. Schroeder was trying to tell you was, here's the problem with that. Taking it to a lab and testing a gun for gunshot residue doesn't mimic the environment, the crime scene in which the gun was fired. So for example, you could take a gun down to the lab, shoot it, and say, yes, I have gunshot residue. But you may have somebody who touched the gun, shot the gun at the scene, and they don't have gunshot residue. You see how those results could be skewed? And the reason for that is there's a lot of factors that go in to gunshot residue. The environment in which it is shot, the amount of time that the killer has. Remember, these elements are like salt almost on your hands. You rub your hands together. You rub it on a surface. You wash your hands. You wear gloves. If he was sweating, those are all things that will cause gunshot residue to slough off. In this case, the defendant's hands were very clean. Now, his shirt had all three elements of gunshot residue, but because they've not fused together in one compound, we can't say it's gunshot residue. And then we got to this. So now you all know what the delay was for from June until now. It was for this. And to be honest with you, when John and I prepped this case, we never even looked at it. Never even looked. Because the lab had tested it in 2016 and told us there's no blood anywhere on his clothes. We took them at their word. There wasn't. And Shelley Rossi went down that Friday on June 2nd of this year, and she wanted to look at the pillows. And when she found out the defendant's clothing the night of the murder was still in evidence, she wanted to look at it. And who can blame her? Because don't you know, if she didn't do that, this defense team would say, you didn't even bother to look at my client's clothes, did you? And she wasn't going to let that happen. So she looked at them. And what she found underneath that badge, we now know, is Antonio Sr.'s blood. And why is his father's blood on his clothes when, according to the defendant, he never went in and checked on them? One of the things she told you was one of the specs, she can't account for it. She told you that. She said, look, it could be blood on his face or on his eyebrow. It dropped. When they put the sticker on, it saved it. She can't rule out cross-contamination. She told you that. It is a fleck of blood, the bigger one is. But that other one, that's not from the same source. The smaller one is a blood stain. It is a small circular spatter. And the only way you get that is through three things. Forward spatter, which we know didn't happen in this case because that means the defendant would have had to be sitting behind his dad on the bed. Backward spatter, we know that didn't happen because we know the shooter was far enough away that he wouldn't have blood kick back, especially with Antonio Sr. and Dome. The only other thing that the blood stain originates from is expiration. And what do we know about the crime scene? We know that when Antonio Sr. was shot, he was facing away from his wife. We know that he had, from the EMT who testified, he had blood all in his nose area and coming out of his mouth. They had to go get a device to suction it out. And we can see the spatter on the bed. Those photos are in evidence, you can see. That is expiration blood that he is expiring from his mouth as he fights for his life. And we know that the person who did this put those pillows over his face. And he had to come close enough in contact to do that. Those blood spatters will dry in air. Shelley Rossi testified to that. They will dry in air and they will become like salt or gunshot residue. The defendant didn't have that sticker placed on him until 5 hours later. And during that time, who knows if more spatters fell off. But what we do know is when that sticker was placed on his chest, it preserved it. It time-stamped it. And there it stayed for 7 years until she went and looked at it. The defense in this case claims cross-contamination. Right? They say Lester Blizzard touched the bloody pillows, and then he touched the shirt, and he could have put his finger underneath the badge. Here's the problem with that. Shelley Rossi told you if that was the case, you would expect to see a bunch of those little spatters from somebody's finger underneath there. And two, it's on the adhesive side of a sticker. If Lester Blizzard put his finger underneath the badge, put it on the sticky side of the badge, you would expect his epithelial cells, contact DNA, to come off of his skin. But when they tested it, it wasn't there. It was a single source DNA profile, and it was the blood of Antonio Sr. But honestly, you don't need it. We didn't need it. We were prepared to go forward to this jury without it. But we had a duty to test it, and the defense agreed as well to test it and see what it was, so we could present you with the truth. But you know what you have in this case that's more powerful than even that? You want to know the answer? Who's responsible for these murders? There it is. It took a long time to go through those records. And we spent months going over them, understanding them, learning about them. I learned about them. Jason DaCosta taught. And you know what my biggest fear was? My biggest fear was when I presented this evidence to you, I had to condense it down to just a couple hours. I'm sure it felt like a couple days for you guys. You only have one shot with the jury. I didn't know if the presentation I had could help understand something that is technical, a piece of evidence, something that took months to understand. This is the truth in this case. This is the cold, hard truth about who committed those crimes. The defense tried to attack the alarm records, tried to say, oh, there's errors in them. I'll be the first to tell you the records aren't infallible. They aren't. There are entries in there, and it happens less than 1% of the time. We know because we did the math. It happens less than 1% of the time. And it's kind of like when you have a cell phone call and the call drops and you call the person back. What happened? I don't know. And you just go on about your conversation. That's what happens because it's being transmitted from the alarm panel to alarm.com via a cellular signal. So there are times in the records that we see entries or don't see entries that should be there. And what you need to know is it happens infrequently, and when it does happen, it is self-evident where it happens. That's why I asked both alarm experts, did the defense ask you on cross-examination a single question about the night of the murders? And the reason I asked that is because the records are so clean from that night. The defense has a theory in this case about those alarm records. Their theory is that when Kayra Armstrong set the alarm that night, a door was open, which would be a bypass. Or they may try and say that when Kayra Armstrong set the alarm, the door popped open. The alarm would go off. I went through the trouble of reconstructing the records to show you this is the defensive theory in this case. If they were right, this is what the records would look like. You would see the living room motion detector activating, the front garage door open. You would see that when she armed the panel, it would be bypassed, and it would show in the records bypass. Now keep in mind, these are critical events. There's a lot of times where the alarm isn't set and the alarm company, there's notifications back and forth. They care most when the alarm is set, what's going on in the house. And you know what they care about most? Bypass, door or window opening, or the alarm going off. So if the defense was right, you would see when Kayra Armstrong set the alarm that it was bypassed. You would see both sensors going idle. You would then see the living room sensor activating first. Because according to them, the killer came from outside the house, inside from the downstairs. You would then see the upstairs going activated. You would could see the panel being disarmed when the defendant opened the door. And when he did that, if the defense was right, the records would show end of bypass. And then he would have to close the door to close the circuit before he opened it again. Not only is that inconsistent with the evidence, there is no scenario in those records that supports that thesis. This is not reasonable doubt. This is manufactured doubt. Big difference between the two. So let's go back to what the records actually show. We know, based on the records, exactly what happened that night. We know that at 9:40 p.m., the defendant came home with Kayra. That living room motion detector was activated, and the same minute, the front door opened and closed. They came in, they set off the first floor motion detector. 12 minutes later, Kayra Armstrong armed the panel. And she was 12 years old, and little did she know at the time that when she armed that panel, it not only sealed the house, it sealed the defendant's fate in this case. Because what happens afterwards is so critical. At 9:57 p.m. that night, the living room motion detector goes idle. Remember, it backdates. So what happened was it waited until 10:57, and it said, okay, nobody's been here for an hour. Report back. Idle. So we know at 9:57, everybody in that house was on the second or the third floor. At 10:39, the upstairs motion detector goes idle. If you recall, when they came home, they went upstairs, they chatted with their parents for a little bit, and at 10:39, that sensor went idle, which means the Armstrongs, Dawn and Antonio, were in their bed, Kayra was in her bed, and the defendant was up in his room on the third floor, because that sensor is right outside the parents' bedroom and also within range of the first floor. One of the things that the defense tried to cross the alarm experts on was reading 2 lines that they had highlighted, not asking any questions to explain it, and then trying to say that they're errors. That's dangerous. Because to understand the records, sometimes you have to go up 5 entries and down 5 entries to understand the pattern of behavior in the house. And that's why they misinterpreted the records. And when I called Jason DaCosta back to the stand, I'm sorry, y'all may have been annoyed because we had heard so much of him, but I had to. I had to correct that misinterpretation. I was not going to let them mislead you as to what these records said. What happens after 10:39 is so important in this case. It's not up there, and John's going to talk about the cell phone activity, but what you need to know, the defendant's phone goes silent at 1:02 a.m. When you look at his activity, he's doing a bunch of things on his phone until 1:02 a.m. At 1:04 a.m., he plugs his phone in the upstairs charger in his room. At 1:08, he unplugs his phone from the charger. And what happens at 1:09? The upstairs motion was activated. 2 technologies, folks. They don't even know each other. And they tell us that at 1:08, he took his phone off the charger. And at 1:09, less than a minute later, the person who walked in to kill these 2 people, the motion sensor caught him. How are they going to explain that? How are they going to explain that? They can get up here and yell about how Jimmy James didn't look in his sink for water 3.5 hours after a murder. They can get up here with their empty boxes and show you flecks of blood. But they cannot answer that. Are they going to tell you that somebody evaporated through the walls of the house at the same time the defendant took his phone off the charger? Let's see what they have to say about that. And what's it tell us about the motion in the house? It tells us it starts on the second or third floor. The killer did not come from the first floor of the house. It came from the second or the third floor, or else the first floor motion sensor would have caught him. At 1:25, the living room motion detector was activated. Remember what happens? 1:25? The killer puts the gun downstairs and writes the note. The defendant called 911 in this case at 1:40 in the morning. And the alarm records and his cell phone activity tells us he was awake the entire time. What was he doing for 31 minutes? What was he doing for 31 minutes? What do you think he was doing? He called at 1:40 and said, I just heard shots in my parents' bedroom. Please hurry. He lied. You know how we know that? Because the gun was placed down on the counter at 1:25. So when he said, I just heard those gunshots, that gun had been on that counter for 15 minutes. You have to be smarter than him to figure out this case. You have to be smarter than him. This is how you know the alarm records were working exactly how they should have. At 1:56, remember the defendant's 911 call? 16 minutes and some change, right? What happens at 1:56? He gets off the phone with 911. You can hear it on the 911 call. You hear him get off the phone, open the door, and say, I'm the one that called. And what do the records show? It showed he disarmed the panel and opened the door at the exact time we know he got off the 911 call. And then what happens? 2 minutes later, the police come in. They go through the back. They're clearing the house. They open the back door, let other officers in, close the door. That's exactly what the records show. If they get up here and try and tell you that Kayra Armstrong set that panel with the door, the window open, they're wrong. And there's no evidence to support that. It's manufactured doubt. It is technology that traps him in that house. It is the alarm records working with the cell phone activity. And go figure, the one thing that would trap him in the house, he couldn't manipulate. He didn't know how it worked. He didn't know how the alarm records were going to report. He didn't know the updates we would have over the years in digital forensics, things that we can do now with phones. He didn't know. He can't manipulate it if he doesn't know about it. When you understand what this means, this case is a simple first grade math problem. There are 4 people in a house that go into the house, that lock up all the doors, the windows are all locked. We know they're locked. By the way, those windows, you can't come in and out and close them from the outside and lock them. It's impossible because the locks are on the inside. We know nobody came in and out of the windows. So you have 4 people that go into a locked house with the alarm system on. While the house is locked and with the alarm system on, 2 people are shot in the head. They didn't kill each other. Somebody put that gun downstairs. Ladies and gentlemen, the only 2 people who walked out of that house, one of them was a 12-year-old girl who was frightened and confused, and she had to be consoled by her grandmother in the back of a vehicle. If there's anything I will agree with the defense on, it's Kayra Armstrong. Had nothing to do with this. There's only one other person in the house that walks out. And you want to know something about that person? He's the only person that was smart enough to remember to turn off the alarm system before he opened the door and exited the house. He's the only person awake at the time his parents were killed. He's the only person handling the murder weapon right before his parents died. Not just handling it, firing it. Not just firing it, lying about it. He's the only person trying to set the house on fire with his parents inside. The only person then lying about how that happened. The only person looking up how to rig a car bomb so it explodes 2 days before his parents died. He's the only person that his parents caught lying over and over and over again. And he is the only person that his parents didn't trust at the time of their deaths. You don't have to take my word for it. Take hers. The alarm doesn't lie. States Exhibit 81, the alarm records from alarm.com. There's 281 pages in this. 34 entries per page, 9,554 entries total. Reading them, doesn't it all read like a book? But it does tell a story. And when I looked through those, it gave me a glimpse into the Armstrong's house. I got a sense for how they used the alarm system and a sense for the routines and the patterns. It's like you could see them yourself. Every day they would come in, close the doors, set the alarm, the motion detectors would all go idle, and nothing for hours. Then 6, 7 o'clock, you tell they woke up, the upstairs sensor would go off first, then the downstairs, they would disarm the panel, walk out the front door, and start their day. And that pattern repeated itself day after day, week after week, month after month, until one day it stopped. One day in late July, it stopped. Dawn Armstrong, when she sent that message, was using the alarm system to track her son's whereabouts. And the truth is, that text message from a mother to a son was also a text message from a victim to their eventual killer. That's the cold hard truth about this case, whether we want to believe it or not. Those 4 words, simple. The alarm doesn't lie. She had no idea at the time that she sent that back in April of 2016, the meaning and symbolism those words now come to represent, paving the way for the prosecution's case, rallying behind a mother who believed in justice, a mother who believed in holding the right person accountable, and a mother who knew the truth long before any of us ever did. Dawn Armstrong is speaking to us in this courtroom today. It's time we listened.
Dementi, you ready to proceed?
Yes, sir. Your Honor, I have a few moments to get situated.
Ladies and gentlemen, feel free to stand and stretch.
I know throughout this, most of this time, a lot of you probably have had maybe some difficulty, especially maybe down on this end, because he sits back over here in the corner, maybe couldn't see him real well. But I wanted to bring you up close and personal. This is AJ. Remember, and it's been a while, back in May, all of War Dyer and all that stuff, when we started. Back in May, we talked to you both as a big group and also individually. And we asked you the question and the concept about beyond a reasonable doubt, and what does a reasonable doubt mean to you individually? Y'all remember that? Especially when we talked to you individually. And you told us what your answers are. And you promised us, and you promised AJ, that you would hold...
Proper argument, Judge, at this point.
Sustained.
The state fully took on the agreement that they would prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And they, including AJ, expect to be held to that burden beyond a reasonable doubt. But ladies and gentlemen, when the state doesn't have sufficient evidence to meet that burden, what happens? They turn to desperation. They start doing things, they start concocting stories, they start speculating. For example, saying the most recent thing, the cell phone, right? What we have are records that says what the activity of the cell phone was doing. It was turned on and off, plugged in, lit up, went quiet. But there's no evidence at all as to what AJ was doing. This is all speculation. Oh, AJ was doing this, he was moving here, he was doing that. You don't get that from the cell phone records. They weren't there. So it's a made-up story as to what AJ was doing, and it's a result of desperation. 7 years. 7 years, multiple proceedings, and the day before, well, effectively the day before this trial was supposed to start, back in the beginning of June, all of a sudden, blood has been discovered on AJ's clothes from that night. So we have to take a break, and we wait till now. But over the course of this break, guess what? There's no blood at all on any of AJ's clothes. At all. So, what we find out is there's 2 tiny specks that apparently don't even match up. They're 2 different kinds that were behind the badge, not on the shirt, but on the sticker. And after 7 years, we're all smart people, but ask yourselves, how did it get there? How did it get there? This long? I mean, you're all smart people, and I'm going to let y'all figure that one out. But how in the world did 2 specks get onto the sticker on the back of the badge, and there's no blood anywhere else on the entire clothes? Desperation. More to the point, the state has called in experts from all over the country. They've called in Dr. Lamoureux from Arizona, that we've heard from in length. They've called in Tim Rader, the ADT guy from Florida. They called in Jason DaCosta from Minnesota for Alarm.com. They've called in all these people. Dr. Lamoureux, originally I counted up, I thought he changed his testimony 3 times in this case. When I actually started counting, starting with his testimony in October, not even a year ago, when he testified that he clearly agreed with Dr. Moeller that Josh exhibited prodrome schizophrenia prior to the murders, starting with that testimony. Then he comes in here On direct examination, he changes his testimony, so that's twice. I get him. I show him his transcript. He flip-flops back, and I said, "Are you sure you want to stick with this?" That's 3 times. He gets back on redirect. He flip-flops his testimony again. That's 4 times. And then yesterday, just yesterday, he comes in here and he says, "Oh, well, I've reviewed a few more records. So now I think maybe he had prodrome schizophrenia closer to the time of murders." He's changed his testimony again 5 times. Ladies and gentlemen, if you went to a doctor for surgery and your doctor told you 5 different things, changed his mind 5 times, are you going to have reasonable doubt as to what that doctor's saying? Is that going to cause you alarm? Maybe to go get a second opinion? Or are you just going to blindly dive off, accept what he's saying, and here, doc, perform surgery on me? What we know about Josh. Josh lost his scholarship. These are all in the medical records. And unless somebody, which I haven't heard yet, has testified that the medical records are a lie and the stuff that's contained and reported by the grandparents and everybody else in the medical records are a lie, then he has lost his scholarship. He got kicked out, failed out of 2 colleges.
Objection, the statement of the records.
Ladies and gentlemen, you as the jurors will remember the evidence. All right,
Okay.
please proceed.
He had to be picked up by his family members, his mom and his aunt, and brought back. We know that when he was brought back, they noticed he had poor hygiene. They noticed he had these empty stairs. S-T-A-R-E, not stairs. All right. He would lock himself into the bathroom for hours, talking to himself. All kinds of behavior that wasn't his normal behavior before he left to go to college. He wouldn't sit with his family at church. He would sit in the back of the church. He would constantly go in and out of the church. Ms. Kay described that he would have death stares towards other people. And what is, I think, more telling than anything, that it was likely also associated with him failing out of college, was his extensive drug and alcohol use. Both doctors agreed and testified that marijuana can serve as a trigger for a psychotic event. Undisputed. Both doctors said that. Problem is nobody can predict when that event occurs. It can randomly occur at any point in time. Now, the problem we have, unfortunately, is that prior to the murders, there's no medical records. There's no nice, neat little stack of diary notes or anything for us to look at, for us to follow. So all we have to go by is what family members report, because he didn't go to the hospital, he didn't get treatment. There's nothing there to document what exactly occurred prior to the date of murders. But let's look at what actually happened on the night of the murders. Josh, within a very short period of time, shows up to the house. As it was pointed out to you before by Kara, Armstrong's house is right here, and right down the street, right here, is Josh's apartments. So from here to here, he shows up to the house. We know that questions asked by Jimmy James regarding gunshot residue, Josh refused to answer, which included his whereabouts where he was that night. He refused to answer. We know Josh was agitated. And we know that Josh smelled of heavy marijuana. Now, I don't think anybody thought of this, because it certainly didn't come out in this case. Nobody, not an officer, not a homicide detective, not a family member, nobody has ever testified that when AJ was pulled out of the house, that AJ smelled like marijuana, or during his interview was otherwise appeared to be under the influence of something. But who was? Josh. We looked at multiple records, if you can also zoom in on it a little bit, multiple records throughout all different types of institutions relating to Josh and his delusional states, believing that he was either God or the devil. We know that he had command voices in his head that told him to harm himself or others. All documented. Just because we don't have documentation, ladies and gentlemen, from before the murders does not mean it didn't happen. It is okay, and it is often scary looking at it. He declared, "I am the brother of Jesus Christ," and that he's on a mission to help save the world, that he has personally saved the world before. He instructed the interviewer to respect your king. I have been ordained. He stated that he is responsible for the lives of others. He also stated that he was previously Satan and that he was part woman and part man. Is this not, in the mind of somebody who's delusional, potentially a reference to the murder of his parents? To him having done it, he saved the world by killing what he believed at that point in time was evil? I don't know. I'm not in the mind of a delusional person, but it's stated right here. And it is stated multiple times throughout the records. He has a religious preoccupation in his head going on. Then we look at the note that night. It is scribbled. Dr. Moeller says, in his opinion, from somebody who's angry. If somebody who's angry, wanting to kill his parents, scribbles a note, it had religious undertones. I have been watching you for a long time, as though you're a god, devil, whatever it is, from the outside looking down, and I've been watching you for a long time. Come get me, or whatever it said at the end. To the point to where it was, hey, I'm untouchable. I dare you, come get me. Leaving, and I asked Dr. Moeller, I was like, what kind of person would leave both a note like this and the gun at the scene? And considering Josh's past, what everybody has said was going on, looking at the totality of these records that occurred after, the doctor said that type of person is a person who can be both delusional and organized at the same time. Even Dr. Lamore, the state's doctor, also said the same thing. You can be both delusional and organized and still commit these murders.
That's your mischaracterization of the testimony.
right, ladies and gentlemen, again, you will recall the testimony that came from the witness stand. All right, please proceed.
That night, how did Miss Kay get to the hospital? She went with Josh and Trenton Teamer. While she was in the vehicle, smelled significant marijuana on Josh. And Josh sat and stared silently and blankly the entire time. We also know Josh never once went into the hospital. Never wants to go see his dad that was fighting for his life on life support. We know shortly afterwards, Josh took off. Josh left the state. Why would you leave the state? If you think somebody's after you, which clearly was the situation, paranoid, he had, apparently from the records, he had paranoia clear back when he was in high school. Thought somebody in a car was chasing him. But why would you leave the state? Because you're afraid somebody's going to catch you, somebody's coming after you? Hannah didn't know why. She just went along with him. She was there to try to comfort him and be with him. But she didn't know why. She didn't know what's going on in his head. And he certainly didn't tell her. Matter of fact, he accused everybody but himself of trying to either kill him or kill his parents. We know that Josh wanted to sacrifice animals on an altar per the Bible. He tried to burn down Miss Kay's house with people inside it. And we know, as it was briefly touched upon, multiple accounts in the documents, in the records, where Josh flat out said, I witnessed, and in other places, I saw my parents murdered back in July
Objection to
2016.
characterization and testimony and the records.
All right, again, ladies and gentlemen, when you go into deliberations, you will be the ones to recall the evidence. All right, let's proceed.
Switching gears a little bit. Tim Rader, ADT. Okay, so we're leaving the Josh and medical stuff, flipping over to the alarm system now. ADT, Tim Rader, again, another expert who's supposed to be solid in his field, supposed to know everything that there is to know about alarms. He was a rock star engineer and was ADT's top guy that they sent to testify on behalf of ADT. In October, this past year, not even a year ago, he flat out said that the errors...
Objection outside the record, Judge.
He testified to it, Judge.
All right, again, ladies and gentlemen, you will be the ones to recall the evidence.
He flat out said that the errors in the alarm records caused him concern with the reporting and accuracy of the records. I questioned him specifically on that and say, hey, Mr. Rader, didn't you say this last time? And he goes, yeah, I did. I said, and you're changing your testimony now? And he goes, yes, I am. And I said, wait, don't you at least want to see your transcript so that you can make sure what you said versus what you're changing?
Objection, mischaracterization of the testimony.
All right, again, ladies and gentlemen, you will remember the evidence. We'll proceed.
And guess what Tim Rader said from this stand? No, I don't want to see the transcript. What kind of expert doesn't want to see the transcript of what their prior testimony was? It's the kind of expert that is changing their story to meet what the state's story is that they want them to say. That's that kind of expert. Let's talk about the alarm system. The alarm system itself. State wants you to believe that somehow the Armstrong's house was a fortress. It was secure. There's no way in, no way out. There was no signs of forced entry, and because they had an alarm system, and because it was armed, it was secure and solid. That's what the state wants you to believe. All right, let's talk about that, because if that's the case, every single piece of evidence relating to Don and Antonio's murders has to be inside that house. Every single piece of evidence. Because if you can't get in, you can't get out. It all has to be in there. So when you start pressing the state, and we heard it earlier, when you start pressing the state about where is the evidence, especially all the scientific evidence, they have nothing but excuses. Nothing but excuses. When we start asking about the DNA, when we start asking about the GSR, when we start asking about blood and blood spatter, there can't be any blood spatter because Don Armstrong had long hair. Okay. Fingerprints, where's the fingerprints? Bloody clothes, shoes, gloves, something that puts AJ in the bedroom pulling the trigger. There is nothing. Absolutely nothing. They just argue to you that they can't say if there's scientific evidence or not. Ladies and gentlemen, if they can't tell you if there's scientific evidence or not, then they can't meet their burden.
Objection to a misstatement of what beyond a reasonable doubt is, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Both ADT and Alarm.com testified that they didn't perform any testing at all on the alarm equipment at the Armstrong's residence. They didn't perform any kind of testing on the accuracy of the records contained in their documentation. They did nothing. They just blindly say, hey, here's our records. You have to believe them. This is solid. This is gold. This is like the Bible. You have to believe it because we printed it out. No backup, no, hey, before we submit this as evidence in this case, let's make sure that this stuff is accurate. None of that was ever done. None of it, the functioning of the equipment, no test was ever done. Tim Rader agreed that the alarm system at the Armstrong's residence is subject to compromise. It's subject to compromise by an intruder who can gain access to the house through a bypass opening. Well, let's look at the errors in the records. This isn't hard to understand. We spent a lot of time going through these records, and everybody explained what these records are and what happened.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point to publishing any document to this jury that's not in evidence.
All right, please approach with the exhibits.
Yes, Your Honor. In July of 2016, and I'm not talking all the way back to April, June, May, any of those months, only July of 2016, there's roughly 1,700 entry of different events for July. Not 9,000 that you just heard opposing counsel try to explain to you. That's the whole period. I'm talking just July. And in just July, 77 times, put the picture on, please. Tim Rader testified that now the motion detector comes to here at the stairs. Y'all remember that? When he's testified that the downstairs motion detector picks people up right there at the edge of the stairs. Well, if that's the case, that motion detector and opposing counsel just told you that anybody that comes in or out those doors, that motion detector is going to pick them up, right? 77 times in July. The downstairs motion detector, and I went through this page after page after page. The front garage door, open, close, open, close. Never once did the downstairs motion detector 77 times get activated. 3 times in July, there were double idles, which means the motion detector went idle, idle, without ever being activated in between. You can't do that. It has to be idle, activated, idle. But it didn't. The records show idle, idle. 2 times in July, there were double activations, the reverse, where it went activated, activated, without ever going idle in between. 13 times in July, the front and garage door. And I went through the front and garage door with Jason DaCosta. I went through the motion detectors with Tim Rader. The front and garage door 13 times had double openings and double closings. What does that mean, remember? You can't have a door that goes open to open without it being closed in between. You can't have a door that goes closed to closed without it being opened in between. Did I say that right? I hope so. So you had double closings and double openings without the appropriate stuff happening in between. That is a total, ladies and gentlemen, of 95, just in July of 2016, 95 errors that have occurred.
Objection, misstatement of the evidence and the records.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, again, it's not for me to decide, it's for you to decide. All right, please continue.
Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, does this create reasonable doubt as to the reliability and the accuracy of these records? Ask yourself, what number do you have to have in the number of errors before you have reasonable doubt as to the accuracy and the reliability of these records? And there's more examples. We know that the front garage door can't be both open and closed at the same time at the top. No. At the top. Looking at State's Exhibit 87, there's no way for a front and garage door to be open and closed all at the exact same time down to the second. If it was open and closed that fast, it would report open/closed. But it didn't. So you've got problems with these records and the way the records report.
Again, misstatement of the expert's testimony, Judge.
All right. Please proceed.
Another issue that we went through with Jason DaCosta was how there is no label. It only said, the only label that's hard, what did he say, hard printed or hard input into the software system is open/closed. You remember that? There is no closed/open alternative. So the argument is that every time something says open/closed, well, then the door must have been left in a closed state. But we know that's not right. Because looking at State's Exhibit 81, you can't bypass a closed door. You have to bypass an open door. And if you look at open/closed, if it was really left in a closed state, you wouldn't be able to bypass it. So that means the door was left open, and then you bypassed it. So we have a problem throughout the records. Every time it says open/closed, you don't really know what the last position of the door was left in.
Objection, misstatement of the testimony again.
Right, please proceed.
And then lastly, when you compare ADT's records, State's Exhibit 87, and Alarm.com's records 81, on the day of the murders, their records don't even match. ADT's records have an entry that the front garage door was open and closed at 9:38, is that in 46 seconds? That same time period in ADT's records, when you compare it with Alarm.com records for the same time period, where is that entry? It's not in there. So some records have things, some records don't. There's some doors left open, some closed. You can't rely on the accuracy of these records as to what happened, especially on the day of the murders. Again, how many errors do you need to have reasonable doubt? So Alarm.com, what they want to do is they want to blame the empty chair. They don't want to blame ADT, and they don't want to blame themselves. So me and my awesome drawings here, what did they do? They tried to blame the cell phone provider, saying, oh, all this information, all these packets, we didn't get these packets. It's like a dropped cell phone call. We didn't get them. All right. Well, did you hear Hannah's 911 call that night? Well, Hannah's right here at Josh's apartment. Here's the house. The cell phone tower covers both these properties, this whole area right here. The 911 operator told Hannah, you must have a bad signal. So we know that the cell phone tower that night had a bad signal in the area, just based on that alone. So it makes you wonder, and have to wonder, what information was lost? What information didn't get reported that night? And lastly, if the panel's armed, and again, we've already looked at right before that, it looks like 940 front garage door open/closed. But as we just saw, we don't really know what position that door was in.
Objection, misstatement of the expert's testimony.
It's not expert's testimony, it's the records, based on the
Objection,
records.
misstatement of the records and the explanation of those records.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, you will be able to review the evidence that has been admitted both on the witness stand and the actual physical evidence. All right, please proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Alarm is set. There may have been a bypass. Could have been. We don't know. We don't know if it got reported. We don't know what happened. But it's easily supported by the fact, if there's no bypass reported, you're not going to have an end bypass because the system's not going to know. So if there was a bypass, somebody comes in the house somewhere in this time frame from the time it was set to the time the upstairs, where is it? The upstairs motion detector gets activated at 1:09 a.m. We know they can come in the house. We know they can go upstairs without the front or the downstairs motion detector ever going off. We've looked at 77 examples of that in the July alone. We know that they can come upstairs, they get tripped, the upstairs motion detector catches them at the top of the stairs, and from the time that that motion detector is activated at the top of the stairs to the time the system is disarmed at 1:56, that's 47 minutes. That is 47 minutes to carry out the murders of Don and Antonio Armstrong, to go downstairs, leave a note, leave a gun, and exit the house. But if you want to bracket it even further, the living room motion detector was activated when whoever went upstairs came back downstairs. That was activated at 1:25. So from 1:25 to 1:56, that leaves 31 minutes for somebody to have tripped it downstairs, gone into the kitchen, pulled open drawers, wrote a note, leave the gun, and exit the house in 31 minutes or less. Ladies and gentlemen, this young man right here deserves far more than to have his future determined based on faulty, unreliable, error-ridden records from an alarm company that can't stand up to their own records, their own accuracy, just for the July month alone in 2016. This, in and of itself, creates reasonable doubt across the board. And while I thank y'all for being so engrossed in this, so attentive, paying all of your attention to this, please return a not guilty verdict. Please find that the state did not meet their burden and do what is right and just under the law, and return a not guilty verdict for AJ. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, does anyone need to take a break before we continue? All right, ladies and gentlemen, please retire to the jury room.
All rise to the jury.